All right, welcome to another deep dive. We've got some pretty fascinating stuff to unpack today.
Yeah, should be fun. Always love a good deep dive.
You know how it works. You send us the sources, and we get down to what's really important. Like, what are the absolute key takeaways? You know, the insights that really matter.
Exactly. No need to wade through tons of material yourself. We'll do the heavy lifting.
Today, we're diving into a real classic of postmodern thought. It can be tough going, honestly, but really important.
I think our listeners will get a lot out of this one.
Yeah, I think so too. So we're tackling excerpts from Jean-Francois Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge.
Now, that title might sound intimidating, but trust us, it's worth the effort.
Right. Basically, we're trying to make sense of this idea of the postmodern condition, especially as it relates to knowledge. Like, how do we even know what we know, right? And how has that changed?
It's about those big shifts in how we understand and justify knowledge. The ground rules have changed.
And I think for a lot of people, this deep dive will really help them understand, like, why those big overarching stories, those grand narratives that used to give knowledge its authority, they're not so convincing anymore.
Yeah, those big narratives, they don't quite hold up the way they used to.
And I think that's really relevant today in a world overflowing with information. How do you decide what to trust?
It's a crucial question. So the source material here, it's philosophy. Pretty dense stuff.
Yeah, it's a deep analysis of knowledge in these complex, developed societies.
But, it's the kind of work that still has a lot to say to us today, even decades later.
Exactly. So brace yourselves for some aha moments. This stuff really makes you think.
Absolutely. Get ready to shift your perspective a bit.
Okay, so Lyotard, right off the bat, he hits us with this central idea. The postmodern condition is all about incredulity toward meta-narratives. Now, what does that even mean? Like, break that down for us.
So meta-narratives, sometimes called grand narratives, those are like the big sweeping stories we tell ourselves about history, about progress, about how the world works, and why things are the way they are.
So, like, I don't know, like the American dream, or maybe the idea that technology will solve all our problems. Those kind of big picture things.
Exactly. And these narratives, they've been used to justify knowledge, to give it legitimacy. Like this knowledge is valuable because it fits into this grand scheme of things.
Okay, I'm starting to see what he's getting at. So, like, for centuries, people believed in this idea of progress, right? That history was moving in a specific direction, towards something better, more enlightened.
Yeah, like that classic Enlightenment narrative, right?
Yeah.
The idea that if we all embrace reason and knowledge, we'll inevitably create a more peaceful, just, and harmonious world.
Yeah.
That's a powerful meta-narrative.
And science, especially, it often presented itself as this engine of progress, this force for good in the world.
Yeah. But Lyotard points out, science has this kind of complicated relationship with these narratives. Like when you judge these grand stories by the strict standards of science, empirical evidence, testable hypotheses.
Many of them start to look a little shaky, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like they're more like myths or fables than scientific truths.
Which makes sense. I mean, science is all about what you can observe, what you can test.
Right. So you can see how there's this potential for conflict.
Okay, but here's the thing that I find interesting. Lyotard argues that science itself, it can't totally escape this need for justification, for some kind of story that explains why it's valid.
Right. It's not enough for science to just say, hey, we're doing science, trust us.
Mm.
It has to offer some kind of explanation for its methods, for why its findings are reliable.
So it needs a story, a narrative, just like everything else.
Exactly. And historically, science has relied on those very meta-narratives that it might also criticize.
So it's like a bit of a paradox, right? Science needs a narrative to justify itself, even as it critiques other narratives as unscientific.
And this is where we start to see the crisis that Lyotard's talking about.
Hmm.
As these big narratives lose their power, their hold on us, well, it creates a crisis for those institutions that rely on them, like philosophy, like the university.
So it's not just about science, it's about these broader systems of knowledge and how they make sense of the world.
Right, like what holds everything together if those big stories aren't doing the job anymore?
So what happens then? Does everything just fragment? Do we all end up with our own little isolated ways of knowing and like never the twain shall meet?
Well, Lyotard suggests that instead of this unified narrative function, we're seeing a kind of a dispersion, things are spreading out into what he calls clouds of narrative language elements. And this isn't just about traditional stories.
Like fairy tales and stuff like that.
Right. It also includes denotative statements. Those are like facts, descriptions of reality.
Okay, got it. So like the sky is blue, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And prescriptive statements.
Mm-hmm.
Those are more like commands, rules, obligations.
Don't run with scissors.
Exactly. And all sorts of other types of statements, each with its own specific purpose, its own kind of pragmatic value. It's like you've got all these different tools in a toolbox, and you use them depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Okay, so instead of one big story for everything, we've got all these little bits of language floating around, doing different things, serving different purposes.
Right. And you live at the intersection of many of these clouds all the time.
Sounds a little chaotic.
It can be. And the thing is, these elements, they don't always fit together neatly. You don't necessarily form these stable combinations that everyone agrees on.
Right. So how do you make sense of anything then?
Well, that's the challenge of the postmodern condition. It's less about these grand, unified theories of human nature like those that were popular in the past, like structuralism, and more about, well, Lyotard calls it a pragmatics of language particles.
Okay, so more about how language actually works in practice, in different situations, in different contexts.
Right. It's a heterogeneity of language games.
So like the different ways we use language, like you were saying, with your friends, at work, in a scientific paper.
Exactly. Each with its own rules, its own little local institutions.
And the people in charge, the decision makers, how do they deal with this kind of messy, fragmented landscape?
Well, often they try to impose order,
Yeah.
using all sorts of tools and techniques. They try to measure things, compare things, make everything fit into some kind of system.
So like data analysis, algorithms, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And they assume that all these different language elements, they can be measured on the same scale.
Yeah.
That they're commensurable. And that the system as a whole, it's predictable, it's manageable.
Oh, and this is where the idea of power comes in, right?
Exactly. They're trying to optimize the system, make it as efficient as possible. And in doing so, they're also, accumulating power. And this can have real consequences for people's lives.
So everything becomes about like maximizing output, maximizing efficiency, even things like justice and truth.
Yeah, that's the tendency. And if something doesn't fit into this model, if it's not operational or commensurable, well, it gets marginalized, excluded. Lyotard even uses the word terror to describe this process, and that can be pretty subtle or it can be very overt.
That's a pretty strong word. So is he saying that the postmodern condition is just like this dystopia where everything is cold and calculated and human values don't matter anymore?
Well, it's not that simple. Lyotard isn't just saying it's all doom and gloom. It's more nuanced than that. It's really a question of, okay, if these big narratives aren't doing the job anymore, what does legitimacy look like? What are the new grounds for believing in something, for acting in a certain way?
Because if it's just about efficiency, well, that doesn't tell you what's right or wrong, what's good or bad.
Exactly. Operativity, technological efficiency, it doesn't have those kind of built-in values.
So where do we find those values then? What are the alternatives?
Well, Lyotard touches on a few possibilities. For instance, Jürgen Habermas, a prominent philosopher, he talked about consensus through rational discussion as a way to establish legitimacy.
So like if we all just talk it out, we can figure out what's true and what's just.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But Lyotard, he's a bit skeptical of this. He argues that it kind of tries to impose a unity, a consensus on this very diversity of language games that we were talking about. And he believes that real invention, real progress, often comes from disagreement, from dissension, from challenging those existing rules.
So instead of everyone agreeing, you need people to disagree, to push back against the status quo, to come up with new ideas.
Right. And Lyotard thinks that postmodern knowledge, it's not something that just belongs to the authorities,
Yeah.
It's something that actually helps us to be more sensitive to differences, to be more tolerant of things that are incommensurable.
Incommensurable, so like things that you can't easily compare or measure on the same scale.
Exactly. So instead of everyone having to agree, it's more about recognizing the validity of different perspectives, different ways of knowing.
Okay, so that's a key takeaway right there. Instead of consensus, you've got this idea of paralogy, invention through disagreement.
Right. And this leaves Lyotard to this big question: can a just society even be possible based on this kind of inherent paradox, this idea that progress comes from dissension? What would that even look like?
Okay, now he gets into these different narratives that have been used to legitimize knowledge historically, He calls them narratives of the legitimation of knowledge. And the first one he talks about is this political narrative with humanity as the hero of liberty. Kind of a classic story, right?
Yeah, very much tied to the Enlightenment. It's basically this idea that all people have a right to knowledge, to scientific understanding. And if they're denied that right, well, it's because they're being oppressed, held back by tyrants or by, religious authorities or anyone who benefits from keeping people in the dark.
So knowledge is power, and everyone deserves access to that power. It's about empowering individuals and creating a more free and just society.
Right. And this narrative, it often focused on primary education, making sure everyone had basic literacy, basic scientific knowledge.
Okay, so like universal public education, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Lyotard uses the French Third Republic as an example of this kind of thinking. The idea was that if you educate the masses, you'll naturally create a more democratic and egalitarian society.
So it's like an educated populace is less likely to be controlled, less likely to be exploited.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Lyotard also points out this interesting tension. He talks about how Napoleon's educational policies, for example, they were often seen as more about creating a workforce, training people for specific roles that would benefit the state.
So are you educating people to empower them as individuals, or are you educating them to serve the needs of the state?
Right. It's a subtle but important distinction.
And it's something we still wrestle with today, right? Like, what are the goals of education? Who benefits?
Absolutely. But the interesting thing here is that even when education is controlled by the state, even when it's about creating a workforce, it still often operates within this narrative of freedom.
So, like, the state is still justifying its actions, its control over education, by saying it's ultimately for the good of the people, for the good of the nation.
Right. It's still framed as contributing to progress, to national unity, even though it might also be about serving the state's own interests.
Okay, so that's the first narrative, the political one. What about the second one, this more philosophical narrative about how knowledge gets legitimized?
This one's really interesting. It's tied to the founding of the University of Berlin in the early 19th century. And, that model, it had a huge influence on universities all over the world, even today.
So this is about higher education, about the role of the university.
Right. And there were all these debates at the time about what the university's purpose should be. Like, should it be about pure scholarship, knowledge for its own sake? Or should it be more about training people for specific professions, for serving the needs of society?
So, like, should it be an ivory tower or should it be more practical, more engaged with the real world?
Exactly. And Wilhelm von Humboldt, he was a key figure in shaping the university's direction. He's famous for this idea of science for its own sake.
Yeah, like let scholars pursue their research freely without interference from the government or from, economic interests.
Right. But Lyotard points out that it wasn't quite that simple. Humboldt also believed in this idea of Bildung, this kind of holistic education that cultivates the whole person, both intellectually and morally.
So it wasn't just about acquiring knowledge in isolation, but also about how that knowledge shapes your character, your values.
Exactly. And this brings up a crucial point. There's a tension between the denotative language game of science, which is all about establishing truth, and the language game that governs our ethical, social, and political actions, which is more about justice.
So, like, just because you know something is true, scientifically true, doesn't necessarily tell you what you should do about it, ethically speaking.
Right. There's no logical connection between a true statement and a just action. Lyotard gives this simple example of a closed door. The statement, the door is closed, that's a true statement, but it doesn't logically follow that you should open the door.
So truth and justice, they belong to different realms, different language games with different rules.
Exactly. And Humboldt, he was trying to bridge that gap to create a unified vision for the university that would encompass both the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of justice.
Okay, so how did he do that? How did he try to bring those two things together?
Well, he invoked this idea of a unifying spirit, which some philosophers at the time called life. And this spirit, it had this threefold aspiration. First, to derive all knowledge from a fundamental principle from science.
So science is like the foundation of everything.
Right. Second, to relate all knowledge to an ideal, to ethics, to social values. So it's not just about knowledge in a vacuum. It's about how knowledge connects to our values, to how we should live.
Okay, got it. And the third aspiration.
To synthesize this principle and this ideal into a single overarching idea. So to bring truth and justice together into a coherent whole.
That's a pretty ambitious goal. And Humboldt thought this was possible because of, He says something specific to the German nation.
Yeah, he talked about the intellectual character of the German nation. And, looking back, it sounds a bit nationalistic.
Yeah, definitely. But Lyotard emphasizes that this whole German idealist narrative, it's actually quite different from the idea of the state directly controlling knowledge, like what was happening in France after the revolution. So instead of the state being the ultimate authority on knowledge, it's this speculative spirit, this kind of abstract philosophical principle.
Right. And for the German idealists, the university was supposed to embody this spirit. It was supposed to be this place where all knowledge could be explored and explained and connected together into a coherent system through philosophical reflection.
Okay, so philosophy is like the glue that holds everything together. It provides the justification for all the different branches of knowledge, for all the different language games.
Exactly. And Hegel, with his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences,
Mhm.
that was a prime example of this kind of ambitious project, this attempt to create a grand narrative of knowledge, a totalizing system that could encompass everything.
So knowledge legitimates itself through this system, through this process of philosophical reflection.
And by doing so, it also ends up defining the nature of the state and society. It's a very specific solution to the problem of legitimacy.
But then comes this idea of delegitimation, right? These grand narratives, they start to lose their credibility, their power to persuade.
Right. So what happened? Why did people start to doubt these big stories?
Well, Lyotard, he points to a few factors. One is the rise of technology, especially after World War II,
Yeah, technology really changes the game.
because it shifts our focus from ends to means. It's less about the big picture, the ultimate goals, and more about how to do things efficiently, how to get results.
Right. It's about optimization, about maximizing output.
And this creates a whole new set of values, right? A whole new way of looking at the world.
Exactly. And another factor Lyotard mentions is the kind of resurgence of liberal capitalism, especially after the Keynesian era. So you have this decline of these big ideological battles like communism versus capitalism and a greater focus on individual consumption, on personal gratification.
So it's less about these grand collective visions of the future and more about like me and what I want right now.
Yeah, exactly. And all this, it creates this environment where those big narratives just don't resonate the same way anymore.
Okay, but Lyotard, he's not saying that technology and capitalism are the only reasons for this decline of grand narratives. He actually suggests that the seeds of delegitimation, they were already there within those 19th century narratives themselves.
Right. It's not just external forces that are causing these grand narratives to crumble. It's something internal, something inherent in the way they're structured.
So how does that work? How can a narrative contain the seeds of its own destruction?
Think about the speculative apparatus we were talking about. This idea that knowledge needs to justify itself through a second-level discourse, through philosophy.
So it's not enough for science to just do its thing. It has to also explain itself, defend itself philosophically.
Right. And this creates this implicit skepticism towards what Lyotard calls positive learning. That's just straightforward empirical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that hasn't gone through this philosophical vetting process.
So like science that's just based on observation and experimentation without a grand philosophical framework to back it up.
Exactly. And if that philosophical justification, if it starts to look like just another story, another narrative, well, then it loses its authority, its power to legitimize.
So it becomes just another language game, no more special than any other.
Right. And Lyotard gives this example of the speculative statement that knowledge only counts as knowledge if it fits into a universal process of development, like this unfolding of the life of spirit.
Okay, so there's this big story about how spirit evolves, and any real knowledge has to fit into that story.
Right. But the problem is that statement itself, the statement about knowledge and spirit, it presupposes the existence of that very life of spirit that it's trying to justify. It's a circular argument.
Yeah, it's like saying, this is true because it fits into this system, and this system is true because, well, just because.
Exactly. And Lyotard suggests that we can interpret this differently in a more postmodern way. Instead of seeing that presupposition as a universal truth, we can see it as just defining the rules of the game, the rules of the speculative game.
So it's not about absolute truth anymore. It's about playing by a certain set of rules.
Right. And this perspective, it was influenced by Nietzsche, who argued that this relentless pursuit of truth, this constant questioning and demanding of justification, well, it can actually undermine the very foundations of knowledge itself.
So like the more you try to prove something, the more you risk proving that it can't really be proven.
Exactly. And this is what fuels delegitimation. The crisis of scientific knowledge. It's not just about there being more and more specialized fields of study. It's about this internal erosion of the principle of legitimacy itself.
The ground is shifting under our feet.
Right. And this leads to all sorts of changes. Those neat boundaries between scientific disciplines, they start to blur, and some disciplines even disappear altogether while new ones emerge.
So the old map of knowledge, it's becoming outdated.
Exactly. And universities, they start to lose that role of providing this grand, overarching justification for knowledge.
They become more about like transmitting information, training people for specific jobs.
Yeah, less about the big questions, the fundamental whys, and more about the how-tos.
Okay, and what about the other big narrative, the Enlightenment's promise of emancipation through reason and progress? Does that also start to break down in the postmodern condition?
Yeah, Lyotard argues that it does. It's a different kind of delegitimation, but it's there. Remember that tension we talked about between denotative statements about what's true and prescriptive statements about what's right?
Yeah, truth versus justice, facts versus values.
Right. Well, the Enlightenment, it kind of tried to ground the legitimacy of science, of knowledge, in the autonomy of individuals engaged in ethical, social, and political action.
So it's like if people are free to reason, to make their own choices, then the knowledge they produce will naturally lead to a more just and equitable world.
Something like that. But there's a problem. There's no guarantee that just because you know something is true, that you'll automatically do the right thing.
Just because you know that climate change is real and caused by humans doesn't mean you'll actually change your behavior, right?
Exactly. There's no logical necessity there. Lyotard uses this example of a closed door again. The statement, "the door is closed," it doesn't logically imply that you should open the door.
Right. Those are two different kinds of statements, two different language games.
And by dividing reason into these separate domains, cognitive and practical, the Enlightenment actually ended up undermining science's claim to be the ultimate guide for all aspects of human life.
So science becomes just one language game among many, not the supreme arbiter of truth and justice.
Right. And this idea was further developed by other thinkers like Wittgenstein, Buber, Levinas. They showed that science, it has its own internal logic, its own rules of the game, and it can't legitimately dictate the rules for other language games.
So science can't tell us what's ethical, what's beautiful, what's meaningful. It can just tell us what's scientifically true within its own specific framework.
Exactly. And this raises the question, what happens to the idea of a unified social subject in this kind of fragmented landscape?
Yeah.
This idea that we're all part of one big, coherent society, sharing the same values, working towards the same goals.
Yeah, does that idea still hold up?
Well, Lyotard suggests that it kind of dissolves in this dissemination of language games.
Dissemination, so like spreading out, becoming more diverse, more fragmented.
Right. The social bond, it's not this single unified thing anymore. It's more like a fabric woven from all these different threads, all these different language games, each with its own logic, its own rules.
So society is like a patchwork quilt made up of all these different pieces.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And this idea, it was very present in early 20th century Vienna with thinkers like Musil, Krauss, and of course Wittgenstein.
So this sense of fragmentation, it's not a new thing. It's been brewing for a while.
Right. But Lyotard points out that Wittgenstein, he also offered a way of thinking about legitimacy that didn't depend on those grand narratives, or even on this idea of performativity that we'll talk about in a bit.
So even in this fragmented world, there's still a way to make sense of things, to find meaning and value.
Exactly. And for Lyotard, Wittgenstein's key insight was that legitimacy can come from our own linguistic practices, from the way we use language, from the agreements we make with each other within specific language games.
So it's not about some external authority telling us what's right or wrong. It's about how we communicate, how we interact with each other.
And the fact that people have largely lost their nostalgia for those grand narratives, it doesn't mean that everything falls apart. There's this implicit understanding that legitimacy is created and maintained within the rules of each particular language game.
Okay, so that's a hopeful note. Now, Lyotard shifts his focus to research, to how knowledge is actually produced in this postmodern context.
Right, and he talks about how the practice of research, it's undergone these significant transformations. He highlights two key developments. The first is the multiplication of methods of argumentation. There are all these different ways of arguing, of making a case, depending on the field of study.
So like what counts as evidence, what counts as a valid argument, it varies depending on whether you're talking about history or physics or, literary criticism.
Exactly. And the second development is the increasing complexity of proof. Modern science, it doesn't just rely on those classical rules of logic anymore. It uses all sorts of specialized languages, sophisticated methodologies.
So it's not just about deduction and induction anymore.
Right, and this diversification of languages within science, it's not arbitrary, it's pragmatic. Each scientific language develops its own rules, its own set of axioms, and it asks for acceptance of those rules based on a certain kind of internal consistency, a certain kind of logical rigor.
Okay, so it's like each scientific field is creating its own little world, its own little system of meaning, with its own rules and its own ways of validating knowledge.
Right, and then you need a meta-language, something like logic, to determine whether a given scientific language actually meets those standards of rigor, of consistency.
But logic itself, it has its own limitations.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Think about Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
those are pretty mind-bending.
They are, but basically what Gödel showed was that even within the most rigorous formal systems, like mathematics, there will always be statements that are true, but that can't be proven within the system itself.
So there are limits to what logic can do, limits to what we can prove.
Exactly, and this applies to all formal systems, including logic itself. Which is interesting because the meta-language for logic is often our everyday language, the language we use to talk about logic.
And everyday language, it's full of inconsistencies, full of ambiguities, full of paradoxes.
Right, so when we say that a scientific statement is true, we're ultimately relying on an underlying axiomatic system that we hope is consistent, that we hope is sound. But there's always that element of uncertainty, that possibility that the system itself might be incomplete, might be flawed.
So it's a bit of a leap of faith in a way?
You could say that. And this acceptance of a scientific statement, it's not always based on absolute rock-solid proof. It often relies on consensus among experts, on a kind of agreement within the scientific community.
So it's not just about the logic, the internal consistency of the system, it's also about the social dynamics, the power structures within the scientific community.
Exactly. And this leads to a certain flexibility within science, right? There are multiple ways of investigating problems, multiple languages, multiple frameworks, and sometimes those frameworks themselves get challenged and new ones emerge.
So science is not this static, monolithic thing. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing.
Right. There's progress within those established frameworks, but there's also progress through the creation of entirely new rules, entirely new ways of thinking.
Okay, so that's the argumentation side of things. What about proof? How does that work in this postmodern context?
Proof is crucial, right? It's how you convince people that your statements are valid, that your findings are reliable.
So you got to show your work.
Exactly. But proof introduces this unique challenge.
Yeah.
You have to appeal to the referent, to the reality that science is trying to understand as the ultimate judge.
So it's not just about logic anymore. It's about bringing in the real world, the empirical evidence.
Right. But how do you do that? How do you prove something about reality? Well, you have to observe it. But our senses, they're limited, they're fallible.
We can't always trust what we see, what we hear, what we feel.
Exactly. And this is where technology comes in. Technical instruments, they act as extensions of our senses, as these sophisticated ways of gathering and processing information about the world.
So microscopes, telescopes, particle accelerators, all that good stuff.
Right. And the driving force behind all this technology, it's efficiency.
Making things faster, cheaper, more precise.
Exactly. Technology, it's not primarily concerned with truth or justice or beauty. It's concerned with what works, what gets the job done most effectively.
Okay, but how does this connect to the idea of knowledge, of scientific knowledge specifically?
Well, as science became more and more reliant on technology, the need for proof, for demonstrable evidence, it became even more important. And the technology needed to produce that proof, it's expensive.
So science becomes a game that only the rich can play.
In a way, yeah. This creates this strong link between money and truth.
Because if you don't have the resources to fund research, to build labs, to buy equipment, then you're basically shut out of the game.
Exactly. And the Industrial Revolution, it really marks a turning point here. Because it reveals this reciprocal relationship between technology and wealth. You need wealth to develop advanced technology, but advanced technology also creates more wealth.
So it's like a feedback loop, right? Money makes more money.
Right. And this leads to this reinvestment of surplus value into research, into developing even more advanced technologies, which will then generate even more wealth.
And this is where science really becomes this force of production, this engine of economic growth.
Exactly. It's not just about knowledge for its own sake anymore. It's about knowledge that can be used to create profit, to increase power.
So the connection between science and profit, It predates the full integration of science into the corporate world.
Yeah. The initial link was between technology and profit. And it's through this emphasis on performativity, on getting results, that technology becomes so central to how we produce knowledge today.
So how does capitalism deal with this need to fund research?
Well, it's a mix of private and public funding, right? You've
Yeah.
got private companies doing their